Hello and welcome to Matters of Mind. My name is Thomas, and this is part of a series that I'm doing on Jordan Peterson's book list. So this one is about a history of religious ideas by Mircea. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. Mircea Eliade. It's a French name. And this is just the first volume, and there's three total volumes. And I really enjoyed this, and I really didn't at times. It was a lot like homework than it was reading a page turner. But the first interesting thing I noticed about this book is, as you can see from the subtitle here, it's From the Stone Age to the Eleusinian Mysteries. You have to get used to reading words that you probably never actually say out loud. Um, but what ended up happening is beyond just these mysteries, it also goes into a few chapters beyond that. Zarathustra, Israel in the period of kings, and Dionysus as well. So that was funny. I just kind of interesting. I don't know why they didn't just say from the Stone Age to Dionysus, but that's what they chose to do. Now, like I said, the book wasn't super compelling. I didn't wake up, every morning thinking, okay, great, I'm going to read some new about some new God that I've never heard of. But, as we're going into these books, there's a difference between a book that you want to read and a book that you think you should read. And I think this is definitely on the list of books you should read, and at the very least, maybe have as a reference tool. I think um, I'll utilize it like that moving forward. If I ever think about a religious idea and want to reference something, it's really easily referenced here because all the different chapters really focus in somewhat of a chronological order on all of the religious ideas of mankind. So if anything comes up from the Stone Age, anything in Greece, the development of their different religious ideas, anything in Israel and Palestine, all of that moving forward, I can always go back and reference and really dig deep into something that maybe I kind of skimmed over as I read through the book. Now, in fact, this book was on my Christmas list, and it was funny opening up the book with all my family there, including my in-laws, and my brother and sister-in-law were kind enough to get this for me for Christmas. And as I open up the book, my funny and witty sister-in-law just looks at me and goes, "Ugh, snooze fest," and that likely is a really good description of what it was like sometimes reading through this. And it was, I really had to focus, and it was easy to get distracted. However, there were several times during the reading of the book that I found some things that were incredibly helpful in understanding mankind as a whole. Now, that first thing was the idea that standing up, that in itself shaped everything. Now, the first real humans, as you look through the evolutionary line, is Homo erectus. Now, remember the word erectus means to be standing tall and straight. Get your minds out of the gutter, please. But Homo erectus, standing up, is very different than all the previous primates to whom we were and are related. And, on the very first page, Eliade gets into this concept, and that really blew my mind because, and it's important to understand, because the fact that human beings, as compared to the other primates then and now, stand up really puts us in a different perceptive space. And you can see this throughout the religious ideas that form throughout the Stone Age and even today, to where there's two axes that we're working with. There's the horizontal and the vertical axes, and that's how we view all of the cosmos. Up is toward heaven, down is towards hell, consciousness, order. Down below is earth and chaos, the unknown. So almost everything, once you understand that, you can read into the fact that almost everything is shaped that way. And the horizontal axis is like having the vertical axis in the middle where everything comes together and links us to the heavens, then the horizontal axis encompasses everything that's mundane, profane on the earth. And the further you get out on the horizontal axis, the further you get into the unknown, the barbarians, people who speak different languages. So once you start thinking of these religious ideas and recognizing the different axes on which they are founded, and understand that that's the main difference between physically the primates then and now, it really helps to shape how you read the stories and see how they're also similar. Now, if you're really interested in what we would call the cosmology of the universe in religious terms, I can't recommend more The Language of Creation. This book is by Matthew Pajot, and you might be familiar with the name Pajot because that's one of Jordan Peterson's buddies who's always, he does the symbolic world. So if you look up symbolic world, Jonathan Pajot, you'll find him. But his brother wrote this book, and it was incredibly helpful in expanding on that idea of the vertical and horizontal axes when understanding the way that religious ideas break out the manner in which the universe is not only created but formed. So that was the first thing that I really enjoyed learning about when it came to reading this book. The second thing is the concept of turning chaos into order. And that applies directly to the creation of the universe. Now, the term that's often linked with these ideas is cosmology. What is the shape and where did the universe come from? And it's important not to approach it from a scientific perspective. There's a difference between understanding how human beings see the universe and how it was created, in the sense that this is the universe of humanity, which is very different than saying, okay, what is this rock made of? Where did it come from? Where did that star come from? What was the origin of the material that makes up the universe? Making sure that you approach it from the idea that human beings and their reality is in itself a universe. And understanding where it came from is the purpose of a lot of these religious cosmologies. Once you approach it from that framework, you can see the consistent change of chaos into order. And probably the one most of us are familiar with that are watching this would be the biblical account of changing chaos into order, which also closely aligns with a lot of other accounts of how the universe came to be, including one that Jordan Peterson talks about a lot, which is the story of Marduk. That one comes from that was from Mesopotamia originally, and it's very similar to the biblical concept of the cosmology, in that they see the world as chaos, and chaos isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just potential. If you think of chaos as potential, there's just a bunch of stuff. There's no order to it, but in the biblical sense, all that chaos is changed into some kind of order. And that's what God is doing. He's saying, let there be light. And by having light, that means there's a difference between light and dark. You define and you also differentiate. Then there's the heavens and the earth. Then there's the land and the sea. All of those things are a manner in which differentiating between different things in order to create categories. And that's essentially what language is. When we're talking about something, we're using language to define things and differentiate them from other things. And once we define and differentiate those things, we can put them in categories and create a sense of order of the universe. And you'll also see that in a lot of these religious stories, God or the gods, depending on which story you're looking at, they're using their wind or their breath as a means to do that, which is akin to using language because we're speaking and the air is flowing through our mouths. And that's the same thing that human beings are doing, which is why a lot of creation stories tend to take man from God, or half man, half God, or seeing being in the image of God, because we're using our words, we're using our language in order to change chaos into order by defining and differentiating and further developing our language. Another really interesting idea that I took from this is the center of the world. Now, the phrase used is axis mundi. That is the axis upon which the world spins. Now, remember, going back to the cosmology and the creation stories, it's not the literal spinning of the world, it's the world of humanity and the world of a human and those humans with which that they are creating a culture, a civilization, or a town, and a place to live. So you can see this practically in the construction of how civilizations or even a home is put together. Where at the center, what is most important and what is tallest, whether it be a fire or a synagogue or a mosque or a church, creating a center is the center of that world, the axis mundi, upon which everything else pivots. So you have a center that's vertical. It connects the heavens and the earth. That's why it's usually some kind of temple or a religious building. And then you have the horizontal axis where you base your life and your view of reality on this connection of man between heaven and earth. And then everything outside of that becomes less and less literally and figuratively and spiritually connected to that center. That's why one of the first things that people do when they start a group, a family, an extended family that turns into a small town or a whole civilization, is they create a city town center, because they need to not only have a literal place to think of, a center of town, and everything else out beyond it is further and further away, but they also need a spiritual centering to where they're reminded of what they created that town for and what their purpose is, what their direction is, something to connect them to the heavens, connect the heavens to their earth, to keep them grounded. Now, you can see a great example of this in how the first settlers that became Americans, one of the very first things they did when they got to the East Coast is they created a covenant. And a covenant is a way to say, we are these people. We have a task and a purpose, and this is what our task and purpose is. In the witness, having God as my witness, this is what we're doing, and this is our direction. So essentially, they're creating a church. That's the very first thing they did to center their purpose and reason. And as they expanded further and further out, they can always harken back to not only that literal center, but that figurative center, in the sense that that was their spiritual aim as they move out. Now, if you're interested in more on that, especially when it comes to the American civilization, I can't recommend more than this: The Origins of American Constitutionalism, Donald S. Lutz, not sure. But what he does is he breaks down, in part of the book, looking at the origins of Constitution, he breaks down the manner in which people actually created an axis mundi in the center of their town, and how that then was evolved into our Constitution and other legal documents. So it was really interesting to see some of the parallels between the original religious ideas and how we ended up with our constitutional government. Now, this is one idea that I came away with while reading the book, and it wasn't anything that Eliade specifically said, but as I was reading through and realizing that the general way in which all of these things happened was that there were gods they were fighting, and the people looked to the gods to identify the reasons behind the way the world was the way it was. And the phrase cause and effect popped into my head, where the gods were the cause and the manner in which the world was situated was the effect. Now, animals don't do that. They don't say, "Oh, wow, there's food here. Why is there food here?" They just eat the food. They react instinctually. And that's something that separates man from the rest of the animal kingdom. We ask questions like that. Now, asking questions like that, in some sense, uh, or maybe directly, and why we even have the idea of gods is asking what the cause was of these effects. So the important thing there is that if all these people around the world throughout time are starting to look at the world as cause and effect, and identifying, even if it wasn't, multiple gods that caused that effect, they're at least setting up a framework with how they're going to look at the world, which is in cause and effect. And you have to have that framework set up to even think about having scientific thinking. So what I saw there was the spark of how scientific thinking even comes to be, where they were setting up this framework of cause and effect, which is exactly what we do today. The weather is different today than it was yesterday. Um, an object in motion stays in motion until acted equally upon it by another object. All those things are cause and effect. If you don't have that framework and assume that all effects have a cause, you can't get to that endpoint without having that framework. So I started to see that framework being formed here as people are creating the religious ideas and talking about the very basic idea of why things happen. So I came away from this book thinking, you know what? Well, I had this idea before, but I think this really starts to concretize this and give me more confidence in this assumption that you can't understand humanity without understanding religion. And I think it's really easy to, especially today, where you seem to see this idea that we had religion for a long time and then we had science that just popped out of nowhere, and we don't need that anymore. But I see that as saying, well, we have plenty of hammers. Why do we need screwdrivers anymore? They're related in the sense that, like I said, with cause and effect, that religious ideas, in some sense, help to set up a framework for the way that we see science, including even monotheism, which is generally accepted as part of the idea of universalism, which assumes that all the rules of the world are the same in Africa as they are in the United States compared to Europe, etc. If there is one God who says there's only one rule, then all the rules apply. So the same thing with science. Physics don't change here north of the equator, and they don't change south of the equator. It's a universalism. So there's all these developments there. And to really understand our current situation, you have to understand where we came from. And then you can value those ideas and make sure that as we develop science and as human beings develop, we understand that we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but you first have to understand and be able to identify what that baby is, or else you have no idea what it is you're throwing out. You may be sawing off the branch that you're standing on. Yeah, so in conclusion, I mean, even if you don't read this book all the way through and there's just chapters that you want to read to understand a religious idea that you always wondered about, this is a great book for that. Each individual chapter is very concise. You can get some really deep ideas and understanding of a religion within 20 minutes or so, depending on which one it is. So having it as a reference tool and just going chapter by chapter every once in a while, totally fine. It's not something that you have to read from beginning to end to get the value from it. And it was also funny to hear some of the ways that Eliade spoke and understand and recognize that voice in Jordan Peterson all the time. So towards these summaries, end of each chapter, where Eliade would have a summary. He would say things like, in the last analysis, so on and so forth. And I always hear Dr. Peterson say, in the final analysis, so on and so forth. So it was kind of like getting to know Dr. Peterson and seeing where a lot of his ideas came from, whether it was just sayings like that, why religion is so important, the story of Marduk and how that's so relevant. So I really enjoyed the thing. One thing I will say is that I was excited to read about the Eleusinian mysteries here, because you may have seen Dr. Peterson talk to Brian Mircea about the immortality key. And in this book, he talks about those mysteries in Greece and how they were tied to drinking of a certain substance that would give people hallucinations, and how that all played into also the development of the Christian cults when they were early on. But in this book, he didn't talk about that at all. It was much more about the development of the ideas, and there was no link to any of the actual drinks. I think he mentions it once in passing, but that just may be because he's looking at religious ideas, and maybe that wasn't even a part of the process and understanding at the time. So thank you for joining me. If you want to comment down below, I appreciate it. And I will be starting on volume 2 on Wednesday. So everyone have a great day. Bye.